You're listening to the Public Health Entrepreneurs Podcast with your host, Dr. Charlotte Huntley. Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining me on this episode. On this podcast, we cover all the topics that are related to anything of interest for professionals at this intersection of public health and entrepreneurship. My name is Dr. Charlotte Huntley, and I'm your host. I'm a public health entrepreneur with over 20 years of experience in healthcare and public health, and I've supported many entrepreneurs along the way. Now, on this episode, we're going to be talking about monetizing a public health podcast. Now, if you did not hear the episode right before this one, okay, so this episode is episode number 18. On episode number 17, I answered the question, should I start a podcast? And I talked about the pros and cons of podcasting. And I mentioned monetization, the ability to monetize your podcast as one of the benefits or one of the pros of podcasting. And I mentioned that I would talk about more about it in a separate episode. So I wanted to dedicate this episode as a continuation and to dive a little more deeply or talk a little bit more specifically about monetizing your podcast. I think that's a big question that people have, and there's all these vague answers. So I'm not giving you a formula. Nope. I am going to share with you some ideas from experience and what I've also seen my podcast colleagues benefit, ways that I've seen them benefit as well, and some ideas and a way of thinking about monetizing your podcast. So there are multiple ways to do this. A lot of it has to do with your podcast style, your niche, your connections, your audience size, and your goals. Okay. So hopefully you can take something from it if you're thinking about podcasting. Maybe it's just a little note, a side note to make here. So just a few things I want to mention with you, thinking about monetization. So the first way, and there's no specific order to what I'm going to share with you, but one of the ways that you can monetize your podcast is through advertising or sponsorships. And there's, even as we say that, there's multiple ways to look to monetize your podcast, considering advertising and sponsorship. So in the traditional sense, for a lot of shows with a very broad audience, you can, with a large number, when people listen to a podcast episode, it's called a download often. So depending on how many downloads you have per episode, like how many people are listening per episode that you can document from your analytics. If you have a very high volume in the thousands and you have a very strong, following, the consistent high numbers, then you're able to advertise in a more traditional sense, which is a very formulaic route. And I'm skimming over this because most of us in this public health niche don't have that type of volume. But what we do have is a specialized niche audience of people, and that is highly valuable. So I want to bring that up front because that was really confusing to me when I first started podcasting, and I was trying to decide, well, how am I going to get to those numbers that some of the more general podcast audience, like the podcasts that serve more general, broader audiences, experience, and we just don't in public health. But there are ways to still monetize or advertise or get sponsors because we are niched, and depending on what your podcast niche area is, if it's what it's serving, can attract certain types of sponsors. There are certain advertisers or companies and organizations who will want to partner with you to run ads to get in front of your audience of your podcast. Or they may want to sponsor some episodes in exchange for you either reading something, an announcement or an advertisement about them, or mentioning them as a sponsor with no other ads, whatever the agreement looks like. But the thing I want you to remember is that when you do that, always consider your audience. I, of course, understand this is a business. It's very expensive. It's time consuming. And for me, when I realized that, okay, I'm in this podcasting thing for the long haul, I needed to find a way to monetize because it was expensive investment, because I was hiring out the support for editing and other things because I needed to leverage my time in that way. So I wanted to my first goal was just to at least monetize enough that I would not have to, it wouldn't cost me to produce the episodes. And then we moved to building from there. So that may be a way to approach it. So when you do that, think about what advertisement or who's sponsoring and what that looks like for your audience member. I always wanted to make sure that whoever I partnered with for ads or to sponsor any part of my podcast. You know, this is, of course, a brand new podcast, the one that you're listening to, but I'm talking about when I first started podcasting on a different podcast. I wanted to make sure that those companies were going to bring value to my listeners or to my audience, or it was something that could be an added, you know how instead of them skimming through the ads, but maybe something they would want to hear about or learn about. I know that on some of the shows that I would listen to, especially back then, I appreciated some of the ads because I learned a lot about some tools and resources that became very valuable for me as I was building my business. So think about not just monetizing and who you may be able to advertise with, because you want it to be a win, not only for your audience that's listening, but for the company that pays you. You want them to feel like they've put their investment into a good place and it's in front of the people that want to hear from them, and they get a return, whether people listening follow and purchase their products or, go back to their service. So you can't make it's not like you're going to have everything be perfect, but you want to strive for not just a way to get the money to help offset your costs of producing the podcast, but to put in front of your audience members a good quality resource or tool. And then for the partner, the company that's paying for the advertisement, for that to be a win for them as well. So it's just some things to think about. Advertising and sponsorship. So you can get creative with sponsoring. I certainly did. Look for those organizations as you build an audience. So first thing you have to think about, you need to build an audience because you want to have something for people need to be listening, so that whatever product or ad that's being advertised or shared in front of them needs to have somebody listening to it to hear it. So you want to grow your audience. And as you look for companies that you may be able to sell to or present that offer, like a sponsorship or an ad for your podcast, make sure that you're presenting your podcast in all of its wonderful qualities, not, these numbers are downloads, because that's not going to mean anything. So I would think, instead of this big, broad, massive audience that we may not have with our podcast in public health, but in turn, a more loyal, niched, quality premium audience, because it is more niched and you've got these specific public health people that are listening. That's kind of niche and premium. So it gives you the ability to customize what you offer to your potential sponsors or advertisers. So those are some things to keep in mind. You can look at any type of healthcare organization who's looking to bridge. You can, of course, connect that public health and healthcare. You see how that could be some synergy there. Think about even pharmaceutical companies or wellness brands or health-focused organizations that would be interested in getting in front of your audience, your podcast audience. So those are some things to think about. You can also think about conferences or events, because if you go to, especially if it's a public health conference or event, go to them and let them know that you have this podcast. This is advertising their upcoming event on your podcast, or them sponsoring your podcast could be very beneficial in terms of like brand awareness for them and them getting in front of your audience and that loyalty and commitment and things like that. So those are some angles that you can use, and some benefits and some pros, some things that you can leverage about your podcast, even though the audience may be smaller than traditional, ad route, but it's premium and it's niched. And look for the partnership and that those organizations that want to also get in front of the people that listen to your podcast. So think about it in that way. It's a little bit of a clever approach, but those are possibilities. Another way to monetize, and I guess just to be super clear, in monetizing that way, you charge the company that's advertising a fee, or you charge them to, sponsor the fee to be a sponsor of your podcast. That's how you bring in the revenue and the money for it. So if it's that event or that organization that conference that's going to advertise on your podcast or sponsor a podcast, they would pay a certain amount of money to be on your podcast, to be mentioned on your podcast. And then that would then in turn put money into your funds to support your podcast. All right. Okay. So another way that you can think about monetizing is through affiliate marketing. I think that that's a wonderful way to go. There are certain programs, softwares, services that we use through my business and that are favorites. We've used now for years. And I do have affiliate agreements with some of these softwares, and I could easily talk to you about it. So if I shared with you about, I'm just use, for example, our favorite webinar software that we like to use, that may be relevant for some of you thinking about public health entrepreneurs. I'm sure many of you would be either already using webinars or would be thinking about it if you're starting a business. So if I'm sharing with you our favorite webinar tool and why we like it, and maybe tell you a little bit more about our journey with it and, how we use it and things like that, then if you're looking to start with a new webinar software, you may be inclined to try that. Maybe I give you the link to sign up and you get a free 30-day trial or something along those lines. And then you can test it for yourself. And if you continue, your price is the same price you would pay if you just went straight to their website. But if you use our affiliate link, because we've shared it with you, and then you go and maybe you decide to purchase it and start using it because of what you heard on our podcast, then we get a percentage, we get a commission back. So that's a way, if you are sharing some of your favorite tools, that you could also generate revenue for your business, especially if the tools align with, it may be something that your audience is interested in. Another example here could be, I was thinking about equipment. So now that I'm talking about podcasting and you may be thinking about starting a podcast, I could talk about podcast equipment. And if I shared a link to purchase, like, for example, the mic that I'm using, it may be the same price that you would pay, but I would get a percentage of the commission if you decided to buy the same mic. Another example is our editing team. We use podcast professional editing service, full service, and they help you launch your podcast. We just use their editing services, and we've used them for years on our other podcasts. So when we started this one, we used the same company, and we do have an affiliate set up. They actually sponsored one of our events earlier this year, and we have a great relationship. We've been working with them for years. So this is a true story. If you wanted to start a podcast and you wanted to look into editing, we would be happy to recommend our company, and we could share that link with you. So if you decided to give them a try, we would get a commission from, being able to promote that service. So it's really well aligned. When you think about affiliate marketing or any kind of affiliate relationship, you want to think of something that's a win-win all the way around. It needs to be something that I personally think it should be something that you have an experience with, that you can really speak about, so that it's just very natural. And then it's the person that you share it with doesn't mean that everybody is going to use that product, but it's the same price that they would pay if they went straight to the site versus going through you. And often people like to use your affiliate links, especially if it's a way that they can say, okay, well, yeah, we can support you. And, thank you. We're going to do this anyway. If you use your link and you get something out of it, then they're happy to do that. I mean, I've done that plenty of times. I'm sure you're listening, that happens quite naturally. So affiliate marketing is a great way to monetize your podcast. You would probably need to kind of test out which affiliate partnerships you'd like to talk about, and, not overdo it, not too many of those, because it wouldn't necessarily be as beneficial or feel as genuine. But maybe some of your favorites. There are several that we created the affiliate agreement with and a relationship with because we love the products. And I just share those when they're relevant. So that is something that not even as much now as I used to, but I'm wanting to do more of that, just because people genuinely ask, what do you use for this? Like, what's your project management software? Or how do you send your invoices? Or what website service do you use? Things like that. So something to think about. And it's very natural. This is also good to keep in mind when you're getting started. The numbers are kind of low. The revenue may not be very high, but when you're talking about trying to offset your costs and just starting to generate some revenue, anything and everything that you can generate to help offset the cost of podcasting is really helpful, and you're going to notice it. So don't despise small beginnings. All right. So I have another example of another way that you can think about monetizing your podcast. And a lot of people do this, and that's with premium content or like membership programs. I've talked to you about our mastermind program on almost every episode, especially recently because enrollment's almost open. And for us, this podcast is a great way to attract people that would be an ideal fit for our mastermind program. So I've talked to you in a whole separate episode about our mastermind program. And then throughout this month, because like I said, we're close to enrollment, I'll be talking about it all the time because I want people to know that if you're interested in our program, apply. That's how we know you're interested. And then we reach out and follow up with you. And then you have the opportunity to be invited to join. After the enrollment closes, we'll mention it every so often because we want people to know, hey, if you're interested in that program, apply and get on that waiting list so that we can let you know when enrollment opens again, which would be December, for example. So there are people who have courses or other membership type programs, and they'll talk about it on their podcast. And so the podcast, like all the things that I share with you on these episodes are things that I also share with the people in our mastermind, and I do when we have our retreats and we do deep dive coaching sessions. These are all strategies that, you're building on that. So some of the things you can take notes on and you can hear and you can just go put it into action. But we have podcasters in our mastermind program. So we have a whole space where those of us who are podcasters talk about things related to podcasting, but we're able to dive a little bit more deeply because we're in that community. So if you have a course or something like that, maybe you have coaching that you want to get into, a podcast is great for that because they get to experience you through these episodes and get a sense of what your coaching style is like. So if you then wanted to give an offer for people to work with you as a coach, a podcast is great because they've been listening and really getting to know you and your style so that when it's the next step for them to start to work with you, like the podcasting is the free resource and they get to test you out, so to speak. So then when there's an opportunity to pay for your services and work with you as a coach, it's like the logical next step for some of the people. So if you are a coach or you have courses or offer trainings, a podcast is a great way to get to know people and then like take them on that journey. The logical next step would be then to pay and enroll or sign up and work with you. So that's a great way to monetize your podcast. Now that route takes consistency and all the things I talked about before. And it's hard to know exactly what that timeline is. And it also depends on, how often your enrollment is open. Like for us, enrollment is open 2 times a year. So it's like generating a pipeline of people that could be interested and apply and be ready. For some people, their programs are ready like right away. You can listen for a while and then decide to buy or enroll or sign up or coaching. They can work with you as your availability opens up. But those are just some things to think about. Those are great ways to monetize your podcast because if it's helping you attract clients and bringing more clients to you, then, that's beneficial, right? It's kind of monetizing itself in that way. Okay, so I'm going to go a step further on some of the things that I mentioned just now with the content and the programs. I'm going to also say consulting services because depending on the services that you're offering, I know with our other podcast, which is Public Health Epidemiology Conversations podcast, I do talk a lot about specifically my work as a consulting firm and who we serve and how the work that we do. I'll dive into that more specifically. And sometimes I will ask, or I will let people know, we have room for one more client right now. Let them know, I describe the detailed type of clients that we like to work with. And I give that information, say we have room for one more client. I did that earlier this year and let people know how to reach out to us if they were interested in exploring that option. And that worked really well for us. We filled that spot pretty quickly. So that is something that if you have consulting services and you have a podcast, having it really well aligned, and then that's a great way to kind of talk about what you do and what you offer in consulting. Okay, let me give you a couple more. So you can possibly monetize by selling products. So let's say you decide if it's health-related products or merchandise, it could be, I won't say promotional merchandise. People are not necessarily wanting to pay to buy your brand and wear it. But if it's a way that they can feel like they're supporting the podcast. So if I said that, for example, and not just use myself, but you start a podcast and you decide to create merch, any kind of merch you want to have branded with your podcast, and you sell that and you let your listeners know that when they buy those items, they're supporting the podcast. That could be a great way to get this loyalty built and have your followers, your listeners of your podcast buy your merchandise, wear it, promote it out for you. And it also can bring some revenue in to help you monetize your podcast. So that's something to think about. I've seen some people do that. Some podcasters do that in public health, actually. So that could be a great way and a fun way for you to monetize as well. So think about products that you may want to either your own branded kind of content, products, t-shirts, hoodies, hats, mugs, things like that. Or if it's, something else. Our brand for this podcast, Public Health Entrepreneurs, we do have our own brand, but it's also very general. Like if we did have some merchandise that we sold, you could buy a t-shirt, Public Health Entrepreneurs. And if you're an entrepreneur, you'd be proud to wear that, right? So those are some of the ideas I wanted to share with you. And one more that I will mention, although this one depends on a whole lot of factors, but I have seen this done. You can possibly get grant funding. You can apply for grant funding. There are opportunities that will support your podcast, depending on the podcast and the details. I know someone who went through a foundation, applied for the grant, got the grant, and the grant covered, I want to say like 2 years of podcast episodes. And something like that. It was like a beginning and kind of end period. So at the end of the grant funded period, he decided to just close it out and have it just be that 2-year period and move on. But you could do that and get funding for a period of time and then continue your podcast by monetizing in some other way. But if you find these private or foundation grants or some sort of grants that align and your podcast fits their initiative, you could apply for that and potentially get some grant funding to support your podcast. So that one, not exactly my favorite option, but it was definitely worth mentioning because some of you are very grant savvy in that way and may go searching and find exactly something to get you going, get you started. So it is definitely an option for some to consider. Okay. So now you probably have an idea of why I wanted this to be a separate episode, but I thought it was worth just sharing a little bit more about monetization because this is a question that's in everybody's mind. If you're thinking about a podcast, I know I had to search around and had a hard time getting some real answers out when I was early on in that podcast phase and trying to figure it out. I did find a really good community of podcasters and that helped tremendously. But, here we are. I'm sharing with you, and I hope that this has been helpful. So as we wrap up, I will remind you about our mastermind program. If that's something that you're interested in, you can find all the details at publichealthentrepreneurs.com. When you're there, click on mastermind, and then you can read all the information. If it sounds like something that resonates with you, you're interested in learning more, possibly becoming a part of it, then click the button to apply and complete the application. It's just a few questions, and that just lets us know that you're interested. We'll follow up with you to make sure you get all of your questions answered. And then if it's a mutual fit, then we get to invite you to join us. Also, I invite you or I ask you to help us share this podcast and help us with the growth, helping other people discover this resource. And you can do that by sharing our web link, publichealthentrepreneurs.com. Share that with a friend or your network. Also, writing a review in Apple Podcasts would be amazing because other people will see the review and it may help them decide to tune in. So you know how it is when we read reviews, we decide to buy or participate sometimes based on the reviews that we see. So that would be much appreciated. Really, regardless of what option you choose, we just appreciate you helping us spread the word about this podcast. All right, everyone. Until next time, have a fantastic rest of your day. Thank you for listening. Visit publichealthentrepreneurs.com to learn more.